as someone who has seen lots of prairies in Iowa, it has the quality that the DNR would be looking for to become a state preserve. All right, so this is a t-shirt the Iowa Prairie Network sells. I think you can still buy these. I saw online. Prairies are our rainforests. You know what that means? Prairies are our rainforests. Rainforests are held as the most diverse ecosystems on Earth. They have the most species. That's true, but only at really large scales. Actually, if you look at, again, at a meter quadrat, like this table, or even, I actually found a research paper that looked at this, up to, say, a 7 by 7 meter area, or 7 yards by 7 yards, which is, it'd just be like a corner of this room right here. A prairie is going to have more species in that small scale area than a tropical rainforest. Here's the ground layer of a typical tropical rainforest. There's not that much growing there. But it can't, because tropical rainforests have so many trees and so many layers of vegetation in the trees that there's hardly any light down there on the ground. So tropical rainforests don't have much diversity in the herbaceous layer. That's what a prairie is, just herbaceous. That's all a prairie is. It's just herbaceous layer. And so all of those species have plenty of access to light. And so there's the herbaceous layer of a prairie. There's the herbaceous layer of a tropical rainforest. So prairies are our rainforest in terms of the diversity that they have in numbers of species. What are the most important families in a prairie? The 5 most important families in terms of numbers of species: the aster, ACE, or the sunflower family, represented by the prairie blazing star here. The Fabaceae is the pea family, legume family. A good representative here is the purple prairie clover. How about the grasses? Grasses are Poaceae. Grasses are the 3rd most important family in numbers of species. They're represented by eastern gamma grass. Rosaceae family, the roses, they're the 4th most important. This is a plant called prairie cinquefoil. I could have put up a wild rose, that would have been good too, but I chose this one. And then the 5th most is the Cyperaceae, or the sedges, the sedge family, which are grass-like plants. This is called bicknell sedge. They are among the plants that are a little more difficult to identify, so unfortunately a lot of inventories often don't fully report the amount of sedges that are present, because identification on those is a little bit more challenging. Those are the 5 most important families. Disturbance. So ecological disturbance is something that comes in, like a fire or a badger or a bison, and kills some of the vegetation, basically. Reduces the vegetation in a place. It produces more open habitat. Resources are made available. Usually happens at small scales in something we call a patch. And there's some great examples. I'm going to show you just a little bit here. But what both disturbance and perturbation do is it helps to increase what I call the heterogeneity, the variation that we see from one place to another place in a prairie. In other words, it's just patchiness. Prairies are naturally patchy in terms of, again, what you see and where you see it, because of these different kinds of disturbances and perturbation. What happens is more niches are made, more environmental variation. That all makes room for more species. And the way that can play out, again, with soil disturbances, is with pocket gophers, for example, right here. I used to, when I was growing up on the farm in western Iowa, one of my jobs was to go out in the hayfield and trap pocket gophers. Because if you're a farmer, you're trying to grow hay, you don't really like pocket gophers in your hayfield. And so that was one of my jobs as a young boy, trapping pocket gophers. Actually, I had a bounty for them back in those days. But pocket gophers create these little disturbances from the burrows that they dig, these little open, this area here, just bare soil. That's a resource for plants. That's an unused resource for plants. That's a place for new plants to establish. And plants that establish there will be kind of a patch. They'll form a patch in this otherwise prairie that surrounds it. Same thing happens when, again, a badger digs up the prairie in search of food or a den, or when a bison lays down and wallows, as that bison is wallowing there, making these things called bison wallows. Places where they get down, they rub into the soil to get dust and dirt into their fur to help relieve them from ectoparasites. One of the reasons. Sometimes these bison wallows then fill up with water in the spring or after rains. And so they are a temporary little wetland of sorts. Well, again, that's creating all kinds of patchiness and heterogeneity to this prairie landscape. These animals are helping to make the prairie more diverse. More important, they support each other. The prairie supports them, and the animals support the prairie. All right, another type of perturbation is grazing. Again, in the natural world, it was bison and elk, mainly that grazed prairie. Now, we do use cattle as a surrogate for bison. They work some way as a surrogate for bison. But here I'm just trying to point out that if you have a lot of grazing intensity, pretty much like becoming almost to the point where it's overgrazed, that creates a lot of bare spots and patchiness. Some places where the vegetation is ungrazed, lots of places where it's grazed down to the ground. That is exactly the type of grassland habitat that these three birds like. Horned larks, vesper sparrows, and killdeers. They like that kind of habitat. So you need that kind of perturbation happening to create it for them. Now, other places that don't have quite as much grazing intensity, moderate grazing, some but not real heavy, they support these species. And here we've got grasshopper sparrows, savanna sparrows, eastern meadowlark, upland sandpiper, and bobolinks. And then finally, if there's really no grazing at all, or very little grazing, you're going to support these 5 species. They like really dense, thick vegetation with lots of litter. Here we've got the Henslow sparrow, the short-eared owl, Dixus alcedron, and northern harrier. So you can see all of these birds need different kinds of grazing going on in that grassland. And unfortunately, of course, many of our prairie preserves that have great, it's really nice that we're in a museum to do this, because those prairie preserves are a museum. A living museum of organisms that, again, used to be in much more abundance than they are now. But no, lots of those prairie preserves, they don't have any grazing going on. There's no way to graze them. That's an important thing that's missing from those ecosystems.
Question: How have your conversations with, say, the Iowa DNR gone with convincing them to diversify their management to accommodate these variety species versus only, say, waterfowl or upland game?
Well, actually, DNR hired me back in 2012 to do a 5-year study of grazing effects by cattle on Kirchner Prairie, a really high-quality prairie up in Clay County. So they want to do grazing on prairies because they know these kinds of effects are what happen. And it's going to be better for all the organisms that need the prairie as their home. It's just a matter of implementing it. There's logistical issues. You got fencing, you got water. You got to get the cattle from somewhere, and the DNR is not going to buy cattle, so you have to have a landowner nearby that you work out an agreement with them. And usually what they do is they provide free grazing on this piece of land, basically, to the landowner under their rules of when they can be there to graze. And so, I see now it's not happening enough. But it does happen up in northwest Iowa, down in southern Iowa, where things come together and they're able to do that. And generally we see,
right?
Yeah, they're still doing burning too. Like up at Kirchner Prairie, they do burning and grazing at the same time. So again, we come back to that bison fire thing that I showed you. You have a chance to get that working again. So It's just that, small little preserves, Acacia Prairie is like 180 acres, so yes, you can put cattle out there. Tipton Prairie, no. There's no way to get grazing out there. Well, not easily at least, right? It's just too small. So, but I want to point out, then you should understand though that sometimes what we see now on our prairies, we think that's the way, it's always looked for millennia. Well, it hasn't had grazing for over 100 years. And maybe it even hasn't had fire, too. So most likely we're not seeing the way that it probably should be. And the point of this is that it's not just the birds, all kinds of organisms, from, if I can name all of these, fox snake, the cloud sulfur butterfly, the 10-line June bug, that's a wolf spider, that's an ornate box turtle, that's a syrphid fly, that's a longhorn grasshopper, that's a 13-line ground squirrel, that's a bull snake, that's a race runner, that's a prairie crayfish, that's a prairie skink, and that's a regal butterfly. And this is just a small, tiny fraction of the other organisms that are being supported by that prairie, that are prairie species, that you often won't see when you visit a site. Number 9, remnant prairie. So what caused the loss of prairie? Remnant prairie means we're looking at a prairie there's always been prairie there for the last 5,000 years. It's still there. The plants we are seeing in a remnant prairie are the descendants of a long line of plants that have been there for probably at least 5,000 years. That's what a remnant is, a real prairie. Of course, we lost most of that prairie because of this right here. In one person's lifetime, in 75, 80 years, the Iowa prairie landscape was converted to an agricultural landscape by plowing it. First with horses, oxen, mules. My grandfather farmed with mules. And then later on, steam engines became involved in more western prairies. So clearly, the main reason prairie vanished, and think about this, all of that 30 million acres of prairie, just think about how many bison and butterflies and bees and all the other organisms were out there on that landscape. And when it got plowed up, they're gone too. Everything's gone. They're gone. Again, I said that had to be in order for us all to be here, right? And so we can accept that. But we don't necessarily need to accept that all of the prairie has to be plowed up. The remnants that we have left, we need to protect. Eventually, again, prairie probably caused the loss of, by far, the most of it. But it wasn't the only reason for the loss of prairie. Not by far. A large amount of prairie was lost simply because of the lack of fire. The lack of fire allowed woody vegetation to come in and take over. And once the woody vegetation got in place and overcame the prairie, it's taller, so it shades out the prairie, sun-loving prairie species. They don't have a chance against a tree. Fire is the best friend of a prairie in the battle between prairie and forest. There is a battle between prairie and forest. It goes across Iowa, one going against the other. That battle, fire is an ally of prairie, of course. Much of the prairie in the Loess Hills was lost because of that. It wasn't lost because of plowing. Can't plow the Loess Hills, they're too steep. Yet probably only, I'm guessing, maybe 15% of the prairie that was in the Loess Hills is left. The rest of it's vanished underneath trees, lots of trees.
When you talk about forests, I think of going west on 80, and I see all these cedar trees.
Cedar trees.
That spring up everywhere, and they're kind of the enemy of the farmer.
Yes, they are. They're the enemy of the farmer that's using a prairie or pasture for forage, because cedar trees will take over and there's no more grass to feed your cows. So that's a good reason to stop the cedars, right? You're not stopping them because you want to save well, you do want to save the grasses, I guess, because you want the grasses to feed your cows. Yes, Cedar trees are the worst. They are definitely the worst. They can grow in any dry soil. See, a lot of the prairie was somewhat, especially further west, prairie was protected from trees because the climate was too dry. Trees like a fairly moist climate, but cedar trees can grow any place that's dry, just as well as a prairie plant can. And so, yeah, but you know the thing about cedar trees is, they are completely susceptible to fire. They cannot survive fire. So anytime you see a lot of cedar trees overtaking an area, it's a sure sign there's been no fire happening there for a long time. Because a cedar, no matter when the fire occurs, if a cedar tree gets consumed by fire, it's dead. It will not grow back in the root system. So fire kills cedar trees outright and directly, as long as you can consume most of it. Now, once a cedar tree gets this big, the fire is probably not going to kill it, because it might not be able to kill all of the leaves on a tree that's this big. It could kill it if there's enough heat that goes into the trunk to kill the fire tissue. But yeah.